Hi, everyone. It's good to connect with you again. And it's such an honor and a pleasure for me to lead into and to present to you Dr. Megan Ming Francis, who's a professor in political science and law, society, and justice at the University of Washington. And you're going to enjoy, hopefully, my conversation with her. It's not a traditional lecture. I didn't ask her to do a lecture because we provided a couple of talks. One is a TED Talk that she's done, and the other is a graduate school lecture. Both of them are really, really rich, and they're important talks that she's done in 2020. So watch them with care. So I'm having a discussion with her, and I'm asking her some questions intentionally. I'm asking her about where she came from, where she grew up, and how she became a scholar. You will note that she's from Seattle and she went to Garfield High School. Previously, Alexis Harris, who's a professor in sociology here at the University of Washington, is also a Garfield High School graduate. So something good is going on at Garfield in our community. So Dr. Francis makes her way from Garfield to Rice University and then to Princeton University, and is mentored and guided all the way, and then returns as a professor here at the University of Washington. And she's doing the very thing that some of her mentors have done for her. And she's doing it with tremendous enthusiasm and such power and such grace. I have a couple of questions for you to think about as you listen to my discussion with her. One is, she talks about the election of Barack Obama, and as being described as a post-racial moment. Many people described it as a post-racial moment. What does that mean? And why were we wrong about this being a post-racial moment, according to Dr. Francis? So what does it mean, post-racial moment, when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States? And why were we wrong about the fact that it was a post-racial moment? Or why were those who described it as a post-racial moment wrong? The second question I have for you as you listen to the discussion with her, what's the role of mentorship in Dr. Francis's life and scholarship, even up to today? What's the role of mentorship as she describes moving from high school to college, to graduate school, to the professorship? So what's the role of mentorship in her development, in her formation? Thank you again on this day. We are post-presidential election and we are into November, and I hope everything is going well for you. Take good care and stay healthy. Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce you to Dr. Megan Ming Francis. You have her bio and you have her background, and it's really quite an incredible background. So Dr. Francis, it's a pleasure to have you here and to have you in the presence of our students. So thank you for finding the time to join us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. Your work is really important to this moment in time because this is a class on 2020, on the year 2020. And there's a lot going on. And you've done a series of lectures, one of which we have, a couple of which we have attached to for our students and for our community. One is a graduate school talk that you gave, and another is a TED Talk that you gave recently. But before we talk about your scholarship and your work and your writing, I want to go back to young Megan Ming Francis, because you're a product of Seattle. You're a product of Seattle Public Schools. You're a home girl. You're home, and you went from Seattle Public Schools. And talk about your experience in high school and when you knew that you were going to be a scholar, and how you made your way from Seattle Public Schools to Rice University and eventually to Princeton. Talk about that journey a little bit.
Yeah, so I actually went to high school at Garfield High School in the Central District in Seattle. I know not everybody else knows like Seattle geography and or high school rivalry. So I just wanted to perhaps provide a little bit of background. So Garfield High School is in the Central District. Central District is an area that was historically a redlined area. And so what that meant is that is the area in which African Americans could buy housing, and therefore it was the African American section of town, at least in terms of kind of like the middle area of the city. And Garfield High School was the high school that was there at the time. And still in a lot of ways, it was in some ways a segregated, not explicitly segregated high school, but it was like, it had probably about a 30-40% population that was Black, which I think everybody knows that Seattle is not 30-40% Black, right? Okay. But the rest was Asian, white, and a small percentage Latinx and indigenous. And like in terms of like the different hierarchies as it pertained to like race and class, for me was just really, really visible. I grew up in the South End to a middle-class family, and I went to Garfield High School, and I like was in so-called regulars classes, honors, as well as advanced placement classes. And in each of these three tiers, like it got increasingly more white and less Black. And I had friends all across not across the university, all across the school. And for me, it was the 4 years that I spent in high school that for me just magnified all the inequalities in our society. And it just left me so confused. So I left when I finished up at Garfield High School. I decided to go. I was like, I need to see the world. And I decided, because I had never been anywhere in the American South, that I wanted to go to Rice University. It was a top school at the time. It still is. Go Owls, hence my like collection over here. And I wanted to pursue actually a degree in computer science. This is actually the story that few people know. I did an internship at Microsoft in my junior year summer at Garfield, and I wanted to be a coder. That's what Megan Francis wanted to do. So I went to Rice. And I took a bunch of classes my freshman year, and I was like, oh no, I can't. No, this is not my destiny. So I was like, but then I was crushed. Like I think students who come to college are with that kind of like, this is what I'm going to be when I grow up. And then I was like, what am I going to do? So then some friends were like, why don't you just take some classes in areas that you think might be interesting? And I was like, that's crazy. But then I just decided to take classes, and I took classes in political science and economics, and I became a double major in political science and economics. And the reason why I became a double major in political science and economics is because those two majors helped me understand the world around me better, right? On one hand, they helped me understand political inequality. Why do our political and legal institutions treat some groups of people different than they treat others? And in terms of economics, I was like, oh my goodness, economic institutions and how things are stacked against some people. Everything in high school made sense.
Now let me go back to high school. So you just described at Garfield High, and you're not just picking on Garfield, because there are a lot of high schools, a lot of urban high schools around the country that look like what you just described. You described three different tiers in one high school, that as you go upstairs, the curriculum gets more rigorous and gets more white. And you navigated all of those sections. How did you do that in terms of your own identity? How did you navigate those multiple communities that were happening at Garfield? And by the way, the students will have been introduced to Garfield because a previous lecture, we had a scholar from Garfield, Alexis Harris.
Okay, you have Alexis.
We had Alexis also. She's also so Garfield's done okay. So Garfield, how did you navigate those different communities at Garfield?
I can say I didn't know. Like, there's no expert way that I did so, right? I think for me, it was allowing myself to being opened up to hearing people tell their story and their truth, and understanding that it all had value, that so many people had very, very different circumstances than I did in terms of the way in which they were raised, as well as their present circumstances. But I just learned so much from a whole array of people, right? And for me, I just really, at Garfield, I was this little girl who came there initially. This is like one of the weird stories. I used to walk with my head down. I was like scared of everything that was around me. And then like a world just opened up to me, and I was just like, I need to learn about how a range of different people live their lives. And so I think that like a non-specific way to answer this question about how I navigated these three tiers is just to open myself up to people and listen to different people's truths. And I think that there's just like kind of that type of relating with people, I feel like doesn't happen as much as it could, because people at the core of them are good people, right? But there's people, and then we find ourselves in these institutions, right? That operate in specific ways, right? So I think that like, for me, it was really important to form these different relationships with people, many of which I am still very good friends with today.
So then you find yourself at Rice and you discover political science and economics, and you start to find your way there. And even as you're describing finding your major, you can see the enthusiasm in you. So you found your passion there.
Yeah. I mean, because I was in these computer science labs. Oh, and like, I get it that I know computer scientists who like love it. And then, but I feel like there's sometimes an inner voice in you. Like, you're never going to love, for the students who are watching, you're never going to love what you're doing like 24/7, right? Like, it's not like, oh, I didn't like it for one day. But like, in terms of the balance of the scale, should be that you enjoy it more than you don't. And for computer science, that was not the case for me, but it was the case for political science for me. Because I had never learned that I was presented as American politics as a type of, it seems kind of crazy to say in 2020, but I'll say this anyways, as a type of sporting game. And there were two sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, and they strategized about how to win the game. But that the stakes were obviously so much greater than the Super Bowl, right? And to me, like, that federal level and then kind of obviously the state and the local level, I think understanding those structures made me feel like I had power, right? Because once you understand structures, you know how to change structures, right? And you know how to become a part of them to actually shift them and change them. So that's why, like, for me, it was just like, oh, okay. Like, I no longer felt like I was a victim to like forces outside of my control that I didn't get, right? Like, there was a logic to these things, and I disagreed oftentimes with the logic, of them. But like, now I knew. So you changed your mind from computer science and you found economics and political science, and then you decided to go deeper after you left Rice, and then you went to Princeton for graduate education. What led you to Princeton, and were there particular people and particular scholars that led you to Princeton? What got you to Princeton? Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. So, because one of the things I did not say, which I should have said, is that part of the way that I navigated Garfield, which is going to be part of the way that I navigated Rice, is through teachers that I had, instructors that I had, and people. I got really lucky. I'm not going to lie. Like, it's just, some of it is like, there's really smart students, right? And we're like, oh, this person, like, against all odds succeeded, which is also terrible, right? Because it shouldn't be against all odds. Everybody should have these different chances, right? So for me, like, one of the key things at Garfield was that there were certain people that came in at different times that provided space for me to talk through things I did not understand, and that like encouraged me along the way, right? Like, I'll never forget this is important for me to say, but at Garfield, it was a time in which there were police officers at high school. I've actually never, it took me leaving Garfield to realize that people go through K through 12 without police officers inside of schools, right? But we called him Officer Mike, but he was a school resource person, and he was a former Black Panther. And he knew the history around how Black students were treated oftentimes in schools, and how they get involved in the system. And he wanted to make sure that he was kind of the first point of contact before anything went wrong. And he would be somebody that would just walk the halls and be like, hey, like, what's up? And it was just like somebody great to talk you through kind of the history of the community, and that really got it and was invested in the development and the excelling of especially Black students. Now, in terms of Rice University, oh my gosh, I'm going to be also honest. I wanted to see the world when I left Seattle, Washington, and went to Rice University. But when I got there, I was like, oh no, where's the trees and the water and the mountains? Oh my, why is it so hot? It's so hot. And I wanted to leave. For 2 years, I wanted to leave. But I had incredible professors, as well as other people at the university. The director of multicultural affairs, Kathy Clack, I will never forget. But they were just people who were like, just invested in me, and they were like, Megan, we see that you're unhappy here, but like, why don't you plug into this? Why don't you start this organization? Why don't you take over this organization? Like, and that, like, I was like, wait, huh? Like, I can do that? And they were like, absolutely. Why not? Like, create the world that you want to see and that you want to be a part of. And I was like, oh, okay, right? And so I did that. And the reason why I ended up applying to PhD programs, right? So all of us, I think many students who might be watching this are maybe shifted career paths. And so I wanted to become a computer scientist. And then I was like, you know what? I'm about to go to business school. And then I was like, no, I'm going to go to law school. And I was on the law school training the longest. And then what got me off is I had this incredible professor, Dr. Alexander Bird, who was a professor of history. And he had done a fellowship at Princeton. And he was like, Megan, have you ever thought about being a professor? And I was like, huh? Like you? And he was like, yes, Megan. And him and this other professor, Dr. Edward Cox. And they were both Black professors in the history department. And I was like, and I literally, until that moment, despite the fact, I mean, and there wasn't a lot, right? Like, these were the two Black professors, and I like took all of their classes because I love to see somebody that looked like me at the university, right?
That mattered to you. Huh?
Yes. And like, I was like, oh, and even though I had them as professors, I still, and this is something that I've had to do a lot of reflection on, I still never thought that was possible for me, because I did not grow up in a world where I knew Black professors. None of them came over to our house. They just were not a part of my world, right? And everything that I saw on TV is like old white men. That's who professors are. Professors do not look like me at all. So when he said that, I was like, I went back to my little dorm room and I started to do research. And I was like, oh, you know what? I can go to PhD school too. So I applied to a number of doctoral programs. I got in. And the only reason why I applied to Princeton is because that professor who asked me, like, put a little seed in my mind that one day that I maybe could become a professor. He had done a fellowship there. And so then I decided to go to Princeton. But I never, ever would have applied to a doctoral program without a professor just pulling me aside and being like, hey, you know what? And I do also want to say this before I kind of like end this longer story, is that I would also not have been ready for graduate school without Dr. Bird and Dr. Cox. And that's in part because they saw me and they also understood my writing wasn't terrible, but it wasn't where it needed to be. And once I got into graduate school, Dr. Bird pulled me to the side and was like, listen, you're going to be taking this class, the senior seminar, and it was still the best senior seminar. It was called Blacks in Reagan's America. And he was like, the ask is only for you to do 2 papers in the class. I want you to write a paper every single week. And I'm going to go line by line your paper, and you're going to get better, and your writing is going to improve. And that first paper took me forever. And then I like got better, and I went into graduate school with basically kind of this crash course on how to write. But it really speaks to, right, the investment of other people into our careers. Like, we are never just like, at least in my opinion, we never just get here by ourselves, right? Like,
I heard you describe this not as a set of just major choices, a subject area choices, but these are really a product of relationships with a range of people, from faculty to an officer at Garfield to advisors, a set of relationships as you found your passion. And I'm also hearing you say it's okay for students to change their mind as they find things that they're passionate about. But it's like stepping stones along the way. People are creating a path for you. So now you find yourself as a PhD student at Princeton, known as one of the elite institutions in the country. And there you are on your way to being a scholar. Are there some folks there that lit your fire at Princeton?
Yes. So, I mean, as we're now talking, I'm realizing that there is a constant theme, which is I hated my first 2 years at this storied institution. In part because I think a lot of us have this feeling, especially for a lot of us who come from marginalized backgrounds, that we don't fit. And I got to Princeton and I went into a department, and my cohort was almost all white of graduate students. And the faculty at the time, which was 65 faculty members in a political science department. right? Like for those at UW, we got like 24 y'all, okay? 65 members, and there was no Black or Latinx faculty. What? There was no classes on race and politics even taught, which is what I actually wanted to focus on. And so without saying it explicitly, but clearly implicitly, they were saying that it's not important to understand race and politics to understand the American political system, right? Like that's really hard not to do intentionally, by the way. So it was initially really difficult for me to figure out and to find my place. What helped me and what sustained me were graduate students and finding community outside of the department specifically, is that like across the university, there were really great people for me to build community with, as well as faculty. So somebody who was around the news a lot, Eddie Glaude, he was there at the time. Professor Cornell West was somebody who I ended up TAing for and was a tremendous help, and like saw me as a Black woman graduate student, like in an almost all white department. So for me, that helped sustain me. And then the end of my second year, I had an incredible mentor, Paul Freimer, who is a white man. He is a scholar of race and politics. And he just invested in like my work. He became my master's thesis advisor and would go on to serve on my dissertation committee. But basically for me, what was so important for my relationship with Paul is that he heard me. Like I was so deeply frustrated. And instead of being like, it's okay, or you shouldn't feel this way, right? Which I think that's because people so like oftentimes want to make us feel better. So, right. So like in the effort of wanting to make us feel better, right? Like there's not even a space for us to like let out actually how we feel. And like for him, I was like, these are all the problems. And I felt like he actually heard me and he affirmed how I felt. And he was like, all right, so like, let's figure out a way. And then the other thing that I so appreciate him for is that in thinking about what my dissertation was going to be about, he did not try to force me to fit it inside of a frame of what others thought it should be, right? That he had enough faith and belief in me that like, he was like, you know what, it doesn't have to be so-called traditional political science. You have really great ideas. And so why don't you do something that you actually believe in that matters to you and I will support you. And so that's like part of my story about Princeton.
But you also had the presence of mind to not just stay in your field and in your discipline, but you formed friendships outside of political science and started to do transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work by forming relationships because American politics has a whole lot to do with education in this country and has a whole lot to do with law, society, and justice, and it cuts across disciplines. So you make your way through and out of Princeton, and eventually you come back home. What brought you back to the University of Washington?
I did. I never thought I would come back, but I did indeed come back. And yes, part of like figuring out my ways through Princeton was finding people across disciplines. And that I think was for me, and I think for a lot of us is a type of survival. Right, which is like, I so am in support of interdisciplinary work and interdisciplinary scholarship because it's incredibly important. So there's a little bit tiny, I think, important backstory about how I got here, which is that I wrote a dissertation about racial violence and the NAACP's campaign around racial violence in the first part of the 20th century. And I defended in November of 2008. And what else happened in November of 2008? Barack Obama is elected as the first Black president of this country, right? I'm in Chicago at the time, doing now a postdoc at the University of Chicago. I go to Grant Park, I am there, okay? But what is going on in our disciplines is it is also the case that academia, I know this for, I think for some people it's gonna sound like so long ago, but I know you remember. Dude. For many people in 2008 across the academy, it was like, oh my goodness, post-racial academia. We are so excited. We no longer have to do these so-called diversity lines. We can get rid of these diversity programs and officers across the university. This is tremendous for democracy, but it's also tremendous because now we don't got to fake like we care about these things.
Post-racial became in the language. It was people were using language like post-racial, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
I take it you weren't convinced.
No, I was not convinced. And the issue for me is that, like, in a discipline like political science, which has always been a little bit resistant to kind of the push around that many scholars, especially in my subfield called race, ethnicity, and politics, REP scholars, try to push on, is that, like, everything, especially in American politics, must engage a focus on race. That you can't understand the presidency, you can't understand public opinion and behavior, that you cannot, right, without an understanding of race. And so, like, it was that I wrote this dissertation about racial violence in 2008, and the year that they were trying to move post-racial. So, and I couldn't get a job. Like, I could not get a job to save my life. I couldn't get a job the next year or the next year. And I actually was like, you know what? There is a great company that began in Seattle, Nordstrom, and I'm gonna go work there for a few years because this academia thing is not working out for me, and I'm tired of trying to make it work for me. But I ended up, I got a lucky break. I got my first job at Pepperdine University. And then what happened, as we all know, is that vigilantes and law enforcement started killing Black people, and it started being recorded. It wasn't a start. Let me like, it's not that they started, it's that it had been ongoing, but now it was being recorded on video. Right. And so Trayvon Martin in 2012, my book comes out in 2014. Political science and many of the social science disciplines are like, oh my goodness, there's something happening in this world, right? It's political science, sociology, it's economics, it's history. And it's like, how can we understand racial violence in this country? Many people, many institutions, academic institutions were caught off guard. And so it was at that point where a few too many institutions came knocking at my email door. And so that is, in that flurry, actually, is how I actually got brought back to the University of Washington. And for me, the opportunity to come back and teach at the university where actually both my parents attended, to teach in a city that still had a deep place in my heart, was an opportunity that I could not turn down. And it is also the case that the political science department at the University of Washington has a deep history of two things that I love. One, a focus on race and ethnicity. Like, in this small department of 25 members, there's 3 other people besides myself that focus on race, ethnicity, and politics, as well as, so that's on one end, as well as a strong focus on what we call public law, but it's basically legal mobilization. And there's 3-4 scholars that focus on that. And for me, as somebody who's really interested in terms of the long Black freedom movement, that was really exciting to be engaged with scholars who focus on race, as well as scholars who focus on legal mobilization. And then, as you guys are finding out in this course, a number of interesting scholars across the university that I can engage with as well.
Dr. Francis, I'm going to come back to this notion of the long Black freedom movement because this historic context is important to you. And you've always known that. But I want to come to this moment in time because within the last couple of weeks, we've had a presidential election. Joe Biden is the president-elect. And you woke up one morning and Kamala Harris was the vice president of the United States. And I read a tweet that you had posted. And it says, for the first time in my career, I'll be lecturing in my American politics course about an executive branch that includes a Black woman as vice president. Describe the meaning of that moment to you as you walk into class and talk about this as it relates to your scholarship and and who you are.
Yeah, no, that's like, I had to sit with that. I was trying to figure out how to compose that in a tweet because that's so, I have walked in now, I can't even count the number of times. I teach for those who don't know, I teach the big survey course in Intro American Politics. We teach it every quarter, but I teach it one of the quarters every year in the political science department. It's about 200 to 300 students. And I'm always aware, right? I'm always aware of who I am when I walk into this classroom and I teach this history and I teach this course, right? I am somebody who, in terms of who presents as a Black woman, I'm a Black and Asian woman. And I teach this history, these topics in which white men are always centered, right? It's a history, especially at the executive branch level, that never includes me, like from the beginning. And so in this, when it's like, it's sometimes uncomfortable, if I'm perfectly honest, right? Like to teach about something that you are a part of, right? And that you care deeply about, but that you're never there. And so for me, especially I notice the difference. It's like, I love it when students get excited about these issues. And I noticed the difference when Barack Obama became president, in terms of like, especially my Black students and my other students of color who were like, yo, maybe this is actually possible, right? And it's also the case in terms of that there was this moment in 2016, and I think that even though Hillary Clinton did not become president of the United States, that like it was possible for so many of my women students that like you could dream that high. And, you know, and maybe not this time, but maybe a future time. And like, for me, as somebody who like understands representation and identity politics, like, and the power of that and what that means to students, like whose lives and futures I care deeply about, and a belief that like all of my students should believe that anything is actually possible. Being able to walk in the winter quarter into my intro political science 202 course and be able to teach American politics and have Vice President Kamala Harris is something that like, I just like, even now talking about it like blows my mind. And I'm so finally excited to see myself in something that I spent decades teaching about. So that to me is like kind of the power like of the moment. And also in terms of the other aspect here that definitely came out through this election is that the history of Black politics and the Black freedoms movement will tell us and teaches us that Black women have been drivers and organizers in terms of that have pushed this country from the beginning until now and made it better, that have made us like, that have helped us redefine democracy, that have pushed our political and legal institutions in really important ways, right? And so, and too often, they've been kind of in the background, right? And finally, she's not president yet, but like finally, it's not totally in the background, right? That in some ways it's a representation of so much work.
Yeah, so for you, it makes sense to understand Kamala Harris. You go back to Ida B. Wells Barnett, and you see this as a collective history, a movement of a freedom struggle. I think it was Ida B. Wells Barnett who said, the way to right wrongs in our history is to turn on the light of truth. And she was doing that many, many years ago. And you talk about her in some of your talks, and you talk about that movement and that struggle over time that leads us to this moment. I want to ask you a question about, because you've mentioned lives that have been lost, and you've named names. And I've heard you say in your talks that we often ask the wrong question about some of the men and women who have been killed, and many by officers, by those who are charged to protect and serve. And so you say to ask the question why George Floyd was killed is asking the wrong question. Why is it the wrong question, and why does it lead to what you call a misdiagnosis?
Yeah, so thanks so much for that question. It's not just this year in 2020, it's obviously the previous years as well, in which I feel like many people across the country have paid more attention to the loss of Black life. And they seemingly, in terms of, are rightly horrified about kind of the incidences and the stories they read in the newspaper or that they see in their social media. And oftentimes it's like, what happened to this person? And, or it's a deep desire about like what I can do to fix this problem specifically. And there's a way in which I know that this has been stated a lot, but I do want to just state that this again, there's a way that we treat each of these scenarios as isolated, right? As aberrations, as like, what is kind of the analogy that I've heard probably the most is that like kind of one rotten apple on a tree, right? But as I think activists, and this is not activists, have made very clear, especially in 2020, that it's not that there's certain rotten apples on the tree, it's that the tree is rotten, right? And I think that it's harder for us as a people to ask deeper questions about our institutions that we have, as well as questions about our own complicity in creating systems that do not treat everybody equally. And those, I think, are the questions. It's like, one, what is my role in this? Because one, how is this a surprise? I mean, that's one of the things I always talk about, right? Which is that, like, if this is a surprise, what rock have you been hiding under? Black parents have been training their kids and having these talks with their kids for years. I don't know Black parents that don't have this conversation with their kids, right? And so the question is, like, where have you been all of this time that we have been living different lives? And what have you not seen that has been so visible to some people, right? And so it's that question. And then it's also a push on asking questions about our institutions and which you think that operate race neutrally. And how can so-called race neutral institutions, not just policing, also schooling, right? Also education, right? Also corporations. How can institutions, government, how can institutions that operate race neutrally treat people differently? Okay. And so I think that, like, those are the deeper questions about our society that we need to have questions those are the questions that we need to ask.
So the community, many people in the community in 2020 have been out marching. They've got placards out in their front yard. I've been marching with some of our young people and many in our community, and many have been holding up signs and chanting and saying names: Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, Philando Castile, Eric Garner, Stephon Clark, Freddie Gray, Trayvon Martin, and George Floyd. Now, these are names that we've been hearing for years. This is not the first time that we've seen a Black man or a Black woman killed on YouTube, on Facebook. It was happening in 2016. It happened again in 2020. What made this moment different? Because you were studying and you were talking about and looking at activism around Black Lives Matter 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and it feels different now. What's different between now and then? Because you have a theory about what's different between then and now. What's your theory about what's different?
I do have a theory. When everything first happened in the spring, I was like, this is not going to last. I mean, in terms of people's outrage and the news stories. And a lot of us are used to this now, especially since 2013. In terms of the SIGO, it's like front page for a few days, and people, so many like white allies are like, oh my goodness, right? And they might participate in one march, and then it's like, whew, that's exhausting. Oh, racism is exhausting. And I'm always like, imagine what it might be to be Black, right? But anyways, so I think like previously that, at least initially when things happened, I couldn't believe that it could last on and on and on. What we've seen, right? And so I have been thinking a lot about the duration and how it endured, because it endured and it's still enduring, right? And so I think that there's a combination of a number of different factors. One, that made things different this time. And so one, I think it's this collective experience that we all had through COVID-19. That COVID-19 is something that impacted all of us. Clearly, in terms of like, there were differences, right? But like everybody almost, not like in terms of who were not so-called non-essential workers, were working from home. Everything kind of like grinded to a halt. And it was something that everybody was aware of. And then also in terms of that initial kind of period, like in March, then what we realized very quickly in April, right? In April was that, COVID-19 kills Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people. Not because that they're more susceptible, like to like in terms of like that, like it's like specifically looking for Black people, right? But that like health inequalities, structural health inequalities create a range of different reasons why we have like dramatic increase, for example, or comparison disproportionate Black death rate, right? So I think there was this, at least for many people, a nationwide understanding of like, oh, that primed people to the fact that there's structural inequalities in our society. So there was that like, oh, things are not equal. Oh my goodness.
Because in your graduate school talk, you gave numbers. You said at the time there were 41,583 Black lives that were lost to COVID-19. That's 2.3 times more than the white population. Those are powerful figures of lives that should have been extended.
Oh, absolutely. These are, in terms of, these are lives that we should not have lost, right? And the disproportionate number was, it's 2.3 times. Like, and that doesn't, and that didn't make more people, I mean, it did make a lot of people pause, but I'm still shocked that it didn't make more people pause, and it still hasn't, right? That there's still not being enough done in communities of color about this virus.
You know, just as you told the story, Dr. Francis, about the need to have faculty who look like you so you have a sense of imagination, I wrote a piece about the need to have elders who look like us, Black men and Black women who just grow old in dignity and not die sooner than their time. But these are stunning numbers to think about lives that have ended way too soon because of the kind of structures and the inequities that you described in your talk. So you chose to talk about COVID in your graduate school talk and race. And why did you choose COVID because here is 2020 again, one of the themes of this. You found yourself cutting across disciplines again, and talking about public health in a pandemic as well.
Yes, because everything intersects with race. Like people have to act like you can treat things in silos. Like you can talk about like health and let's say climate justice without talking about racial justice. That does not make any sense, right? And so in terms of, if I can even slightly return to an earlier question you raised, which is about kind of like how things felt different this time, it's that I think COVID primed people in terms of that there were like deep inequalities in our society. And then what happened, I think, because of, I think to understand these racial justice protests means to understand also the confining conditions of the health circumstances, right? It meant that because of COVID-19, that people could not do things that they normally do. They couldn't go to work. They couldn't go to their kids' recitals, right? They couldn't go on trips, no more fancy brunches, no dinners, theater. Everybody was just inside with some people they liked and some people they didn't like. And they had their phones and their computers, and they were like, finally, it was like, you are forced to see what you have been running from for so long, right? And then people were like, oh. And like, but I think that my sense, especially as somebody who has focused on the long Black freedom movement over the past century, okay, is that people will run from racial injustice, will run from racism, will run from addressing white supremacy. These are deep and complicated issues that do not have like easy, quick fixes, right? That need and necessitate a deep, enduring commitment that lasts not just a day and not just weeks or months, but years. That really demand a transformation in what you actually care about. And so like, I think like that's also what created, I think for me, a much greater change than we have ever seen when it comes to racial justice in this country. I have never, as a scholar of this, and I have never seen anything like 2020 when it comes to racial justice protests.
Does that give you hope? Is one question I'm going to ask. I'm going to hold that question actually, because so you're talking about the long haul here. So just as with Obama being elected, didn't represent a post-racial moment. Kamala Harris being the vice president doesn't represent a post-racial moment. You describe this as being something that we have to be in for the long haul. You describe Black Lives Matter as our collective story. It's not just about Black folks, it's our collective stories. It's everyone's collective stories. So it's rural parts of the United States where there are signs that's part of their story. Urban areas, global, it's part of our collective story. I think that's the language you use, quote, collective story. You see this as all of us, not just a moment in time.
Oh, absolutely. This is, I think that 2020 made it very clear. And this goes into kind of an earlier point that I raised about racial justice, that so many things that we think are actually siloed away are actually not siloed away. They actually, in so many ways, connect with like the demands in which you heard from the streets around systemic and like institutional racism, right? That like in terms of this fight, in terms of the movement for Black lives and the organizations associated with it, isn't just to make like the lives better for their members, right? That it's actually a fight to make this country and this world better. To like think about what are more equitable systems, like in the agriculture sector, right? In the industrial sector and the corporate sector, right? In terms of like international law and human rights. It is a push in terms of what this movement is trying to do is to make all of us and our institutions better. And so that's why I think that it is kind of this collective story about all of us. But I think sometimes the way that I feel like sometimes people like to talk about the Black movement for Black lives is this is a thing for Black people. Like I'm gonna do a little bit of charity. I'm gonna go up there and I'm gonna help Black people. No, you're helping yourself, right? You want a better world. Okay, I hope so, right? I hope that we all have imaginations and dreams for a more equitable world. And that is at the end of the day, kind of distilled in its like simplest form, what the movement for Black lives is actually about. But the problem here is that racism and white supremacy are things that are like eating and are rotting everything that we want to build on. And you can't build the systems and the things that we want in this world unless we address that rot. You can't have clean water. You can't have better stuff. It just won't work. Not unless you address deep, enduring racism in this country.
And yet you say it's hard. And I want to point something out also because I saw it in myself. When you said, and I agreed with you, when you said people are rallying at this moment, and I had the same feeling that people won't stay in this because it's too hard. And when you said it's too hard, that this is really hard and tiresome, you actually smiled and laughed, and so did I. And what a paradox that we were actually laughing at that phenomenon. And I was trying to think about why I was giggling at the fact that you were even giggling. And I think maybe it's even kind of a protective thing that we just know that we're in this. We have to be in this for a long haul. We have to find not a sense of humanness, but find ways of coping, but just know that this is a reality that is just part of who we are. And so I noticed that you said that with just almost matter-of-factly that this is hard, and we're going to be in this for a long, long time. And you said it almost with a smile on your face, like this is the work that we do. This is what we do.
That's just it. Like there's not like a different world. Like there's no out. There's, at least for me and for you, there's no out. I mean, so like so here we are. And I think that, I mean, it's interesting for me. People are like, Megan, right? It's like some of my friends, well-intentioned, well-meaning, people who I love. Like, isn't it exhausting? Like, isn't this so crazy? Like, how do you not get down? Are you okay? I'm okay. It's not like all of a sudden things this is new, right? Like this has been going on. It was worse before because you guys acted like it didn't even happen before. So like now you guys actually know. So I like, to me, that's progress. And what I often tell people is that, listen, like you have to find joy and you have to celebrate joy and success. Like what also it means to understand the long Black freedom struggle and to actually be in it means to understand that like it's long, and like people and strategies are going to adapt, right, over time, and that you have to celebrate the wins when they come, and like that's just part of the work. Like I mean, I'm sitting here thinking about another way to answer this question because I just like don't know another way to live life.
So we're in it for the long haul. One of your faculty at Princeton used to mark the distinction between hope and optimism. Do you make a distinction between this? What gives you hope in this struggle and in this work? Because you're in it in your heart and in your soul, in your scholarship. You write about this, you talk about this, you walk this. What gives you hope? Given what you're seeing now in our nation in this moment in time, what gives you hope?
Well, 2020 actually gives me a lot of hope in ways that I initially came into, again, in June, in these, Lord, I'm about to be exhausted again. Here we go. And I actually have emerged from that spring and summer and being like, you know what? Like, this time, these young people, these people who are now awakened, I don't think, let's keep it 100. I don't think they all are going to be here next year, and that's okay, right? But like the movement has grown. If we look at the Long Black Freedom movement, especially even if we look at its current iteration, the movement for Black lives, like I've seen dramatic progress over even, let's say, the last 5 years in terms of the shift in public opinion, the change in strategies. And for me, one of the things that I find like so exciting, I'm like even going to go like one step further than hope, but what I find so exciting actually about this moment is that seemingly the current calls that are no longer about reform. And it seems that people understand the difference between reform and transformation. And that there seems to be a type of understanding, maybe not the majority, but this greater understanding that what is needed to actually make Black Lives Matter is a transformation of a number of the institutions that we have, and not kind of small reforms around the edges, but a full-scale transformation. And I think we're having a number of exciting conversations about that. And that, to me, in 2020, makes me really excited about like movement building, moving forwards, and how a possible Biden-Harris administration might actually think about and be influenced by the work of the movement. And this is the last thing I'll say here, is that it is so clear, right, where I am sitting, we are recording this 1 week after the election, that movement building like is transformational. And that's like where like true democracy actually is. It's not in political elites. It's not with our storied political institutions. It is really with the people. And so the organizing that especially been driven by Black women in this time period, that's super exciting. And that gives me hope.
I have to make an observation also, because I think some of this has been inspired by your work and your thoughts about what constitutes a movement. Because I felt this juxtaposition. Sometimes when I watch marches on television, I see windows being broken, I see violence, I see torches. But at times when I've walked out into the community and joined marches, I've seen care, I've seen decency, I've seen collections of people come together, smart and informed and educated and thoughtful, caring for each other, passing out PPE, making sure people have masks. And I see an inspired, ethical, driven movement. And there's such a juxtaposition between what I see on TV, which seems so violent, and what I have actually seen in the community, which is what you're describing. And many of your students, you've described, walked out of your class and made their way out with their fist up, thoughtful and caring, and yet strident and have a sense of verve. So, and it seems like there are two different representations of what constitutes the movement that you're talking about, because the movements that I've seen that you're describing have been very, very powerful and very thoughtful, and many of them driven and guided by young people who are very well informed and very, very inspired at this moment. Yeah. So that's a powerful part of your teaching, I believe.
Oh, thank you for that. I really appreciate that reflection.
So my final question to you is, so you described so much of what those from Garfield High School to Rice University to Princeton had done for you. It wasn't just that they taught courses, but they recognized you, they inspired you, they nudged you along. And I hope you recognize that for so many of your students, that they see you that way, that you've become that person for them. Are you aware of that in your own teaching and in your own mentorship and in your own enthusiasm for your work?
No. Oh my goodness, it's making me blush. So I mean, for me, in part, I am fully aware of how I got to where I've gotten. And in terms of kind of how I've always thought I would repay that is by paying that forward. And so I try to do the best that I can to reach out to students. and to be half of the professor that Dr. Bird and Dr. Cox was to me. I do not think I am at that level yet. I am trying. But I think for me, it's like, if anything that I want my students to walk away from my teaching and my courses, it is like, like in terms of a takeaway, it is one, that these systems, the political and legal structures, that they are not black and white, that there's a lot of gray, that they are what people decide to make them. And then second, that they have tremendous amount of power, and that they can go into these institutions and they can change them. I'm currently teaching a U.S. courts and civil liberties. It's basically a con law class right now. And like the running joke that I always say, it's like my auntie joke in the class, which is that like, if you go out and you like do public interest law and you do law that matters, come back and find me and tell me. I'm so excited. And if you do corporate law, you don't need to email me. But like, and it's just that like, I try to at least like show throughout my teaching that that's the type of work that matters in terms of like thinking about other people and whatever work you decide to do in the future.
I want to say something else about your work that matters, because I know that you've been a senior democracy fellow at the Carr Center, and you've been a justice fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard Kennedy School. So you're doing work and scholarship at the highest level. And I think I've told you this on occasion. I've before COVID hit, I was walking through a neighborhood at a little coffee shop, and I looked at a poster next to me, and there was your picture at this coffee shop doing a public talk at a bookstore somewhere in Seattle. And I thought, that is public scholarship at its best. You are not just going to your national conferences, you're not just presenting to other scholars in the world, that you're actually out in the community presenting your work and making sense and making our community better. And I remember sitting there having coffee and thinking how grateful I was for you, Dr. Megan Ming Francis. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for joining our class for 2020.
It's good to be here. Thanks so much.